Hello, I'm John. Welcome back. Today I'm going to be talking about James Michener's Kent State, which is his search to discover what happened on May 4th, 1970 at Kent State University when the National Guard opened fire on uh, Vietnam War protesters on the campus. So James Michener, of course, and there he is, was a pretty serious author in his day. He wrote many books: Tales of the South Pacific, Chesapeake, Centennial, Poland, Space, The Bridges at Toko-Ri, The Bridge at Andau, etc., etc. He apparently would spend 12 to 16 hours a day at his typewriter sometimes. So he was a pretty serious writer. And he was called in in the wake of the Kent State shootings to write a book based on they had got together some researchers who had went out into the field and talked to students, talked to the people of Kent, talked to professors and National Guardsmen as much as they could, talked to people in the local government and the state government. And James Michener went to Kent himself and spent more than a week there talking to people and trying to find out what caused this shooting, what led to this point of no return, why were 4 students killed, who were they, why were they there that day, was the shooting justified on the part of a National Guard, what was the reaction to it by the students, by the people of Kent, nationally, and he dives into the changing times, changing social life, changing lifestyles of that time, the different views on the Vietnam War. So this is a very well-researched book. There were a lot of interviews done, and in fact there are pictures in the very front of the book of some, not all by any means, but some of the people that were there that day, whom he talked to, who the researchers talked to. And there were a lot of people who did not want to be identified and who did not want their photos included. And I just thought this was really good for what it is. So this was published in 1971, and Michener starts off on the Friday before the Monday. So the shooting at Kent State happened on a Monday, and on Friday, so the night before, Richard Nixon had gotten on TV and announced that he was going to be sending, I'm not exactly sure what was going on, but he was going to be widening the war in Vietnam to include Cambodia. And so the Vietnam War protesters throughout the nation felt like Richard Nixon was deliberately going against what he had campaigned for, which was to end the war in Vietnam. And they felt that this was an illegal move on Richard Nixon's part, and that he was basically throwing away the Constitution, right? So a couple of students at Kent State got together and they buried a copy of the Constitution. And this sort of set off this whole chain of events in a way. This was kind of the first rumbling. That night, there was a street in Kent with a bunch of bars on it. There was a riot where people went out and they burned things in the street and they broke out windows and spray painted some things, but nobody was injured or anything like that. But this really scared the people of Kent, and Michener goes into why that was, how these hippies and these protesters were looked at as arms of the Soviet communists, the Chinese communists, the North Vietnamese communists, the Cuban communists, how these groups were secretly being aided and instructed from within by these foreign groups who were out to destroy the United States from within. And so the more old-fashioned conservatives of the nation were absolutely terrified, and they would see these long-haired, beaded, barefoot hippies in their strange clothes with their beards, and they were terrified, right? They didn't feel safe. So the governor and the mayor of the town, the governor, they got together and they brought in the National Guard. Or, well, I'm getting ahead of myself. On Saturday night, I believe it was Saturday night, one of the things that the people at Kent State had been protesting very vehemently was the presence of an ROTC on campus. And on that Saturday night, I hope I have my facts straight, they burned that down. And then the National Guard was called in. And so on Sunday, everything was all right. There was a burnt down building, but the National Guard and the students were pretty well getting along. There are a lot of pictures. There are a lot of pictures in this book. One of my complaints is that they are not in order in any way. And they are not, there's no like photo 1 or photo 2, no exhibit A or exhibit B to refer to in the text. So you kind of have to look around. I don't know if that was fixed in later editions. This is a first edition. But that would have been very helpful. So on Sunday, everything was all right. On Monday, there was another protest on Monday, and it was declared to be illegal. And so it became, the police and the National Guard were trying to end this protest. And at one point, the National Guard, a team of the National Guard got scared and they opened fire on these protesters. And Michener is trying to determine whether that was justified, whether they actually had a reason to feel threatened, to feel that their lives were in danger, and to use all these people's eyewitness accounts and the photographs, and there is a video, and there are, I think he says, 3 separate recordings of what happened, which was a 13-second barrage of gunfire at protesters who had rocks and who were very far away actually from them at the time. So there were 4 students killed. Let me see, there's a picture of them here towards the back somewhere. Allison Krause, Sandy Scheuer, Jeff Miller, Bill Schroeder, and the bottom picture there is of Doug Rentmore, who was injured. There were, I believe, 9 injured and 4 killed. All 4 of the ones who were killed were more than 250 feet away from the National Guard. The farthest was almost 400 feet away. And in the immediate aftermath of this, you had, so the more old-fashioned conservatives who were terrified thought that it was justified, thought that they had it coming, thought that this was the right thing to do, and that more of them should have been shot. And Michener really exposes their bigotry and their selfishness and their hypocrisy and anti-Semitism. And I thought that was really, really interesting, really well done, and really fair on the part of Michener, because he was clearly an admirer of the establishment, an admirer of straight-laced people and business and all of that. He was a square, right? James Michener was a square, but he was very fair in his dealings with these people, pointing out what was messed up about each side. So this was a time of chaotic change in American history, right? And we like to think that that's only happening now in the good old days. Everything was great. And that's not true. There have always been upheavals and protests and chaos throughout American history. I mean, America was created through protest and chaos. And Michener points out that, yes, okay, so there is the SDS, there are uh, the weathermen, Weather Underground. There are probably Cuban agents in America who are funding this, and there are people like what was his name? The was it Jerry Rubin or Jeffrey Rubin, the Yippie leader, who are fomenting all of this sort of stuff, who are trying to agitate the youth of America and get them to turn on their parents and turn on the capitalist system and all this. And Michener dives into that and looks into that. He also looks fairly at the concerns of the people of Kent who were afraid that these long-haired hippie barefoot dope addict, that's how they describe them, dope addict communists, dope addict communist revolutionaries are going to tear down their city and do all God knows what. And I feel that Michener was really fair and balanced mostly. He seemed to me to take a very personal stance against one of the four that was killed, Jeff Miller. He repeatedly calls him a freeloader and a scrounger and wishy-washy kind of conformist who just went along with the people around him. And it seems personal and overdone because he hits on that point repeatedly, and I couldn't really see a point to that when, for all intents and purposes, Jeff Miller, to someone of my generation, just looks like a normal kid. I mean, maybe he was screwing up in some ways, but most kids screw up, right? Most kids are freeloaders at times in their lives, and I really didn't understand why Michener came down so hard on him in particular. Now, there is a subtle thread of sexism that runs throughout this book, but Michener was born in, I believe, 1907, and this was at a time when women's lib was in its infancy, I suppose. Uh, there was the old-fashioned view that revolutionary politics and these sorts of lifestyles and these sorts of words are not really acceptable for young women or women at all. And Michener does hit back against that, but it is clear that he is bewildered by that and he does not like that. But he says that it's not something that is worth killing over, right? It's not something worth being super upset over. And Michener does have a tendency to describe what the women in this book looked like, but he describes what everyone looked like. Uh, because he was a novelist and what people looked like was very important to him. So he wanted to describe everybody. He wanted everyone reading this book to know that these are normal college kids. They're not filthy, dirty. They're not dope addicts. They're not disgusting. They're just kids who dress differently, or they're kids who dress conservatively, or whatever. But at the bottom line is that they are just college kids. Now, another thing that I took a bit of dislike towards was how he treated Mary Vecchio, who is in the most famous photograph of, oh no, cover fell off. The most famous photo from the Kent State shooting, which is this, won the Pulitzer Prize in 1971, I believe. But what this photograph does not tell you is that she was actually a 14-year-old runaway from Florida who just happened to make it to Kent through a series of adventures. And I feel like he was not very fair to her at all because he described her as kind of a vapid moron who just bounced from place to place and basically is already a failure at this young age. And I feel like, I feel like, imagine that a 60-year-old man comes into your house after this event. This is James Michener, this writer, and he talks to you. I mean, you're going to be nervous, and you're also going to be going, yeah, well, why are you here? Would you leave me alone? So I feel like his assessment of Mary Vecchio was not particularly fair. That's not the photo that really stood out to me in this either. The photo which stands out to me is this one. This is a couple of minutes later by the same photographer. And you can see Jeff Miller lying there. But when I saw that, I thought of the line from Stand By Me. Richard Dreyfuss has this line that is, the kid wasn't sleeping, the kid wasn't sick, the kid was dead. And that hit me really hard, actually, unexpectedly. Because, I mean, I was young once and did stupid crap. I can't say that I wouldn't have been there just to be there. I mean, imagine something's going down on your campus. Why wouldn't you go see, right? And you're 400 feet away and you take a bullet. That could happen to anyone. But there were a couple of passages I wanted to read, and neither of them have to do with the shooting itself. For one thing, I'm not entirely sure what I could say on YouTube, because this is, after all, a sensitive subject. But I thought that I would read a couple of passages here, just to give you an idea of Michener's writing. So, here we go. Many readers may deride our contention that lifestyle played an important role at Kent. Comparison should be made of two events which occurred in Ohio during a space of 6 months. One, a riot at Kent State on a Friday night in May. The other, a riot at Ohio State on a Saturday night in the following November. At Kent, 1,000 people were involved. At Ohio State, 40,000. At Kent, the riot lasted about 2 hours. At Ohio State, 12 hours. At Kent, some dozen business establishments were damaged without looting. At Ohio State, about 60 with some looting. At Kent, no one suffered bodily harm. At Ohio State, many did, including a student who was shot. At Kent, about $10,000 worth of damage was done. At Ohio State, about $30,000. By any index you choose, the Saturday night riot at Ohio State was 3 or 4 times more serious than the Friday night riot at Kent. How, therefore, can one explain that Ohio went into a frenzy over the Kent riot and took the Ohio State disturbance in stride without a strong reaction of any kind? At Kent, the governor felt obliged to fly in and charge the participants with being worse than brown shirts. Curfew was clamped down. Vigilante groups were openly discussed. The National Guard was summoned with loaded rifles. 4 students were killed, 9 others were wounded, and the university was closed down to general approval. At Ohio State, none of these things happened. For there was this significant difference. The Kent riot involved persons addicted to the new lifestyle. It seemed to involve politics, and it was sensed as alien to our way of life. The Ohio State riot was conducted by persons who adhered to the older lifestyle. It celebrated a football victory over Michigan, and it was recognized as a traditional part of our heritage. We knew how to handle it, how to jolly it along. Police were understanding and not attempting to break it up, and newspapers were jovial in cataloging it as merely one more example of normal hijinks. This dual reaction of our establishment society, accept a football riot, punish a political one, is perhaps understandable and perhaps inevitable, but it highlights the necessity for explaining the nature of the new lifestyle and those elements in it which lead to overreaction. And I thought that I would also read a passage where James Michener tries to point out one of the things that he thinks has caused the rise of this new lifestyle these hippies with their bare feet and their beads and their pot smoking and all that, and their protests and their violent breaking out of windows and spray painting things and all this. So here we go. And this will kind of show also what was going on at the time, and an older generation dealing with a younger generation they don't quite understand. And one of the things that they were going, that's the cause right there. Here we go. And it also shows that Michener was really part of this old school. He didn't go to an Ivy League college. I believe he went to Swarthmore, which is known as a secret Ivy school or something of that nature. It's very hard apparently to get into Swarthmore. I think it was that college. I cannot remember. If I'm wrong, I apologize. I looked that up about a week ago, so my memory is not always that great. Okay, here we go. An older person cannot be with the present crop of university students for long without realizing that he is dealing with a new type of individual, and after trying to isolate wherein the difference lies, he concludes that it derives from a cultural phenomenon whose influence he had previously underestimated. We are confronting America's first television generation, born and reared in the shadow of the tube, and the impact is tremendous. These young people learn by means of a new synthesis of visual and oral sensation. They participate each night in the unfolding of history. To them, the present is infinitely more significant than the past. Family patterns are eroded, both by program and commercial, in which fathers are shown as flabby moral incompetents and mothers as incredibly stupid, concerned only with the whiteness of their children's laundry. Passivity before the television set replaces the activity of the backyard, and non sequitur transitions from subject to subject replace the orderly development of logic. Thought is fragmented into brief segments. If only he could see smartphones, right? And the internet. Two factors are paramount. In the average dramatic situation shown on television, a solution is found through immediate action, often through non-legal channels. That the action is almost always violent is not so important, apparently, as the fact that it bypasses the normal legal processes. If there had been an appalling reliance upon direct action, street action, non-negotiable demands, off the pigs, we've talked long enough, it must be because this generation has seen such action triumph in 1,000 different television dramas. Taking things into our own hands has become a way of life, and if it works so well on television, it'll work just as well at Kent State. Perhaps even more important, however, is the visual impact of the young actors who appear on the screen. The most popular are loners, opposed to society, at odds with their fellows and prone to violent responses. They talk and dress in exaggerated style and allow no place for what used to be the responsible, well-behaved young man or woman who is concerned about ordinary problems which he grapples with in ordinary ways. It is futile for a family to argue with their son to keep his hair short when every peer type he sees on television does just the opposite. The old adage that art imitates nature has been reversed. Students now imitate art in music, appearance, vocabulary, behavior, and manner, and ideas. Thus, the great popularity of Indian dress and Western manners can be attributed only to television and motion pictures. We are producing television children whom the university tries to educate as if they were the old-fashioned library students. It is not accidental that the young professors who are most popular with the students and most influential in their growth are closer to television than to the library, and we were constantly surprised in our conversations at the number of times someone said, Tim Butts made the 6 o'clock news, or Jerry Persky made Walter Cronkite, or Professor Lewis made the big television show out of Cleveland, as if this were the greatest accomplishment a member of the university could aspire to. At the house on Ash Street, students watch television even when they are studying. So, I just thought that was it's kind of neat looking. I thought that was a really interesting passage because I personally have an interest in that sort of thing, the television's influence on people, on the youth, on society in general, because one of my favorite books is Neil Postman's Amusing Ourselves to Death, which is where he talked about the effect of television and how it was creating this sort of shallow, short attention span society where people just accept what they see on television and don't take anything very seriously. Uh, but anyway, that is James Michener's Kent State. I really enjoyed it. I thought it was really good. I'm sure there are books which have come out with more interviews and more information in the 50 years that have passed in between. And if you're interested in the Kent State shooting, uh, I would recommend this one. It's really good. It's a good place to start, I think. So I want to thank you for joining me today, and I'll see you next time.